Cuba is a place of layered identities, at once colonial, Creole, Afro-Caribbean, revolutionary, and ever-evolving. To understand Cuba is to traverse centuries of migration, blending, resistance, and redefinition. On the island today, the major social and ethnic groups, white Cubans of European descent, mixed heritage Cubans, Afro-Cubans, and smaller communities of Asian or immigrant ancestry, do not stand as rigid monoliths but intertwine. Their histories are intertwined with sugar, slavery, revolution, music, religion, and daily survival. As we move through the lives and legacies of these groups, we begin to see why many people today feel drawn to Cuba's streets, rhythms, and stories, and what it might cost to live there. The story begins with white Cubans, whose roots lie largely in European settlement. From the earliest Spanish arrivals in the 16th century through subsequent colonial expansion, Spain's influence shaped Cuba's architecture, institutions, language, and elite classes. Many white Cubans trace ancestry back to Andalusia, Galicia, Extremadura, and even the Canary Islands. Over the decades, waves of Spanish immigrants and other Europeans, French, Portuguese, Italians, joined the colonial tableau, reinforcing the dominance of a Eurocentric elite. In the plantation economy, political administration, landholding class, and commercial life, white Cubans occupied much of the top tier of society. Under colonial rule, racial hierarchies were deeply entrenched. Whiteness signified privilege, access, and power. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, before the Revolution, white Cubans were often landowners, merchants, administrators, or professionals. When the 1959 revolution unfolded, it unsettled that hierarchy. A significant number of white Cubans, particularly those associated with the upper classes or who opposed the revolutionary regime, emigrated, many to the United States, especially Florida. That mass exodus reshaped the composition of Cuba's white demographic. Those who remained had to adapt, accepting both the revolutionary state's ideological rhetoric and the changing social landscape. In modern Cuba, white Cubans still occupy visible positions in society, though identity is complicated. Many have mixed ancestry yet self-identify as white, and social class, appearance, and local perception influence that identity more than pure genealogy. Yet alongside white Cubans, and in many ways forming Cuba's social backbone, are those of mixed heritage, people whose ancestry spans both European and African roots, and, to a lesser degree, vestiges of indigenous lineage. Over generations, the unions, voluntary, coerced, formal, or informal, between European settlers and African-descended peoples produced a growing mixed-race population. Since Cuba's native indigenous populations were largely diminished early under colonial impact, disease, displacement, forced labor, the mixing that came to define Cuban identity was largely between spirited African communities and European colonists or their descendants. In the 19th century, as the volume of the African slave trade increased in Cuba's sugar economy, the opportunities for mixing grew. Children born of these unions often navigated ambiguous social spaces. In some contexts they could pass as white, in others they were marked as black. In many cases, they occupied a liminal zone between categories. After the revolution, the government championed a national identity that de-emphasized racial division, promoting the idea of a unified Cuban citizenship over race-based distinctions. That ideological shift affected how many mixed heritage people understood themselves. Today, many mixed Cubans feel they embody the Cuban ethos. Not fully white, not wholly African, but decisively blend both. Their identities can be fluid, on one occasion identified as white, in another as black, depending on class, neighborhood, or individual perception. They serve as cultural and social mediators, bridging traditions, aesthetics, and spaces across Cuba's social spectrum. While white and mixed populations contribute heavily to the visible architecture of Cuban society, the Afro-Cuban population holds a foundational layer of cultural depth and historical resistance. Many Afro-Cubans are descendants of enslaved Africans brought during the transatlantic slave trade, especially during the 17th through 19th centuries, to labor on sugar, coffee, and tobacco plantations. Those African ancestors came from diverse regions: Yoruba, Congo, Igbo, Bantu, Fula, Warara, and brought with them religious practices, music, language fragments, social structures, and creative worldviews. In colonial cities, enslaved and free black people formed cabildos de nación, mutual aid societies organized along ethnic lines, for example, Lukumi, Congo, Karabali. These cabildos preserved African customs, enabled social support, and at times acted as spaces for covert resistance under colonial supervision. The cabildos masked rituals, dance, music, and religious worship under the guise of socially tolerated festivities. After slavery was abolished in late 19th century, Afro-Cubans entered a new era of struggle. They contended with entrenched discrimination, limited access to education and economic opportunity, and exclusion from political power centers. The Cuban Revolution claimed to address racial inequalities by expanding universal education, healthcare, and social welfare. However, structural inequalities based on skin tone or social position persisted beneath the surface. Afro-Cuban communities in practice continued to grapple with barriers to wealth accumulation, representation, and full social inclusion. Nonetheless, Afro-Cuban cultural expressions permeate Cuban identity. Santeria, syncretic religion combining Yoruba beliefs with Catholic saints, rumba and conga rhythms, bata drums, Afro-Cuban jazz, and dance all draw from African roots. A particular society, Abakua, remains alive even today, a secret men's fraternity rooted in the Epe, Efik, Calabar, traditions from West Africa. Initiates engage in ritual dance, encoded language, ceremonial mask procession, and a code of moral conduct. Abakua serves as a profound reminder that the African in Cuba did not vanish, it survived in secret, in resistance, in adaptation. Beyond these primary groups, Cuba has smaller but meaningful threads of Asian and immigrant ancestry. In the 19th century, Chinese indentured laborers, often called coolies, were brought to Cuba to fill labor shortages in plantations and railway construction. Over time, many Chinese Cubans assimilated, sometimes marrying into Afro-Cuban or mixed families, often losing the original Chinese language, yet preserving bits of heritage in cuisine or family lore. Another surprisingly small group is the Korean Cubans, about 800 in total, descendants of Korean immigrants who initially came to Mexico and then some onward to Cuba in the early 20th century. Today, many no longer speak Korean. They live as culturally Cuban but carry memories of a distant origin. In earlier decades, Cuba also received small communities of Jews, Lebanese, Syrians, Haitians, and Caribbean migrants, especially in urban commercial zones. Before the revolution, particularly in the early to mid-20th century, these immigrant groups contributed to trade, commerce, and local niches in Havana, Santiago, and other cities. While many of their descendants have long since assimilated, their existence reminds us that Cuba's social fabric has more threads than the dominant ones suggest. All of these communities did not simply develop in isolation. They influenced each other, shared space, borrowed cultural forms, disputed status, and coexisted in tension. That dynamic interplay contributes to Cuba's reputation as one of the most syncretic societies on Earth. But why would someone from outside these groups, or even someone within a diaspora, be drawn to move to Cuba today? The reasons are multifaceted, emotional, intellectual, and material. Cuba is often romanticized for its cultural and artistic depth. The streets pulse with music, the night with dance, the walls with murals, the rhythms of Afro-Caribbean drums woven into daily life. For musicians, dancers, writers, painters, cultural researchers or travelers seeking immersion, living in Cuba feels like entering a living archive. Every corner offers rhythms, improvisation, public performance and layered traditions rather than staged tourism. For Spanish speakers or those wishing to intensively study Spanish, Cuba offers deep language immersion in a variant of Caribbean Spanish flavored by African cadence and colonial intonation. The chance to live among people for whom language is not performance but daily breath appeals strongly to many. On a practical front, Cuba can appear economically attractive. Relative cost of living, affordable local goods, lower real estate costs, at least compared to many parts of the developed world. That said, affordability is contested. Cuba has periodic shortages, supply chain constraints, dual currency systems, and regulatory distortions. The promise of lower housing or rental costs must be balanced by the challenges of bureaucratic inertia, limited infrastructure, and uncertain supply of essentials. Some people move out of ideological conviction to live in, or experiment with, socialist or post-colonial models, to explore alternatives to capitalist norms, or, for activists, intellectuals, or scholars, to embed themselves in a society with a different orientation toward equity, sovereignty, and resistance. Others move for family or heritage, to reconnect with ancestral roots, to join a spouse or partner, or to reclaim a cultural lineage. Sometimes the longing for a past home or the curiosity about migration stories drives individuals toward Cuba. Yet for all its cultural appeal and idealism, the concrete details of life in Cuba, especially property, housing, and real ownership, are challenging. If you ask, how much does a house cost in Cuba? You'll find data with caveats, but some rough averages are illuminating. Across provinces, moderately sized houses or apartments often list in the ballpark of $40,000 to $50,000. In Havana's mid-tier neighborhoods, many apartments cluster around $40,000, while highly desirable, restored colonial properties or central locations command much more. In Santiago de Cuba, well-placed properties might list $55,000 or more. In less developed provinces or rural zones, properties in some locales may fall lower. Houses in places like Las Tunas might go for as little as $17,000 in certain circumstances. Real estate portals and Cuban listings show ranges from $35,000 to $70,000 plus, depending on condition, location, and buyer relationships. But the critical caveat: foreigners in Cuba generally cannot freely own property. Some exceptions exist, through marriage to a Cuban, holding property in a Cuban relative's name, or purchasing from another foreigner. But these routes are bureaucratically constrained, legally uncertain, and require extensive negotiation with governmental agencies. Many sales operate informally or semi-legally, and any transaction typically requires navigating official permissions, registration, and oversight. The dual currency regime, state subsidies, and structural instability complicate property's role as a stable investment. For someone planning to move, it is often safer to rent initially, get to know neighborhoods, build local trust, and only cautiously consider property purchases. If one is fortunate and well-connected, acquiring a Havana apartment for $40,000 may be possible, but it should not be assumed. The legal, social, and economic risks are real. In the grand sweep of Cuba's identity, the stories of its people always remain central. White Cubans, mixed heritage Cubans, Afro-Cubans, and smaller Asian or immigrant groups each carry legacies of migration, oppression, adaptation, resilience, and creativity. They did not just arrive, they shaped Cuba's music, religion, language, political culture, and daily life. Modern Cuba continues to struggle with the tensions born of history, inequality, colorism, recognition, opportunity gaps, but the cultural vitality is undeniable. For someone considering relocating to or engaging deeply with Cuba, the draw lies in entering the social and historical narrative that is alive, contested, palpable in streets, songs, ceremonies, and whispers of memory. If this narrative has sparked your curiosity, The next step might be diving into personal stories. Interviews with Afro-Cuban musicians, memoirs of Chinese-Cuban families, or walking a Havana neighborhood and listening to local voices describe how they see themselves. Cuba is not a static museum, it is a living discourse. You are not just visiting, you are being invited to read its people, to witness their traces, and to learn how identity, migration, and belonging still unfold.